One Soviet tank against an entire Wehrmacht tank division. The outcome seemed foregone. But when the smoke cleared, 36 German machines remained burning on the battlefield, along with hundreds of soldiers. It would seem like a triumph. But instead of glory, the commander of this tank received the brand of a liar. Staff officers simply refused to believe their own eyes. The enemy loss figures were so monstrous that they were considered fantasy, and headquarters was afraid to send them to Moscow. How did one crew manage to stop an army? What was really happening inside the tank that took a blow intended for an entire front? And why was the name of the man who, in essence, single-handedly saved Leningrad erased from public memory for decades? The truth, which surfaced half a century later, is shocking. One Wehrmacht tank division, 11,000 personnel, hundreds of trucks, motorcycles, and tractors, and a steel fist of dozens of tanks. All this armada, grinding dust and bones, was moving toward Leningrad. Against them, on this specific section of the map, stood exactly 5 Soviet machines. This is not the arithmetic of war. This is a death sentence, signed in red pencil on a staff map. There was no room for hope here. Only the naked statistics of calibers and armor thickness were at work. If you are used to thinking of war as beautiful banners and parade formations, forget it. On the 18th of August, 1941, near Leningrad, war did not smell of laurels, but of overheated machine oil, cheap tobacco, and the sticky, cold sweat that breaks out on your back when you realize there will be no tomorrow. The Luga defensive line had been breached. It sounded dry, like the crack of a breaking branch, but behind these words stood a catastrophe. German wedges were entering the body of the Soviet defense like a red-hot knife into butter. The road to Krasnogvardeysk, and that meant to Leningrad itself, was open. Time did not exist. Minutes stretched into hours, and hours burned away in seconds. In this time loop, in the stuffy dugout of the headquarters, 2 men met who understood perfectly well the price of lies and the price of truth. Division Commander Major General Baranov and the commander of the 3rd Tank Company, Senior Lieutenant Zinoviy Kolobanov. Between them lay a map on the table. Paper, worn by fingers, crisscrossed with arrows. The blue arrows, the Germans, were thick, confident, arrogant. The red markings of the defense looked like pitiful scratches. Baranov did not raise his eyes. It was physically painful for him, a combat officer, to give such an order. He understood that he was sending men not into battle, but to the slaughter. But behind him stood a city where millions lived. And this city did not yet know that its fate was being decided right now, in a conversation between 2 tired men in the middle of a forest. "Block 3 roads." The division commander's voice was hollow, devoid of intonation, as if he were reading an inventory of burned property. "Roads leading to Krasnogvardeysk from Luga, Volosovo, and Kingisepp." Kolobanov remained silent. He was a professional. He had been through the Finnish campaign. He had burned in a tank. He knew how skin melts and how a man screams when ammunition detonates inside an armored box. He looked at the map not as a picture, but as an engineer looks at a blueprint of a failing bridge. He saw the terrain: swamps, forest, narrow bottlenecks of roads. A calculator of death was already clicking in his head. 5 heavy Kliment Voroshilov 1 tanks, 47 tons of fury each, 75 millimeters of frontal armor. 76 millimeters, the caliber of the F-32 gun. Against them were German Panzers, light and medium, maneuverable, with excellent optics and radio communications, but with thin skin. It was a duel between a sledgehammer and a pack of wolves. The sledgehammer is heavy and clumsy, but if it hits, there will be no bones left to gather. Stand to the death, Baranov added. In movies, these 3 words are spoken with anguish, accompanied by dramatic music. Here, they sounded like the clang of a bolt carrier. No pathos. Stand to the death, in the language of military professionals of 1941, meant a simple technical task. Exchange your lives for time. An hour, 2, a day, as much as possible. Every knocked-out German tank meant minutes won for the evacuation of factories, for the construction of new barricades on the outskirts of Leningrad. The crews were to become a cork, a plug in the throat of the German offensive, and this plug had to be driven in so deep that the enemy would choke on his own blood. "Task understood, Comrade General," Kolobanov replied. His face remained a mask. Not a single muscle twitched. Emotions are extra weight. It is tight in a tank. There is no room for fear or doubt. There is room only for reflexes, knowledge, and the coordinated actions of 5 men locked in a steel box at a temperature of plus 40 degrees. He walked out of the dugout into the stifling August. The air was heavy, saturated with dust and the soot of distant fires. Somewhere over the horizon, artillery boomed, monotonously, like a giant hammer driving piles. Kolobanov approached his machines. 5 behemoths, 5 fortresses on tracks. The KV-1 was a monster of that era. Clumsy, frequently breaking down, with a stiff transmission that the driver-mechanic could only shift with the blow of a sledgehammer. But it was invulnerable to most German guns. The German 37mm cannons, which Wehrmacht soldiers contemptuously called door knockers, could only scratch the paint on this giant. Even the 50mm guns of the new German Mark IIIs could only penetrate its armor from point-blank range, almost right up close. Kolobanov knew his machine. He knew its limits. He knew that the V2K engine, with 600 horsepower, roared so loud that it blocked your ears even in a headset. But this roar was the sound of life. As long as the diesel is working, the turret is rotating, and the barrel recoil hydraulics are functioning, you are alive. A tank is not just a piece of iron. It is an extension of the crew's will. It is a second skin, thick, impenetrable, but sensitive to every blow. The senior lieutenant gathered the crew commanders. The men looked at him. Young, different. Someone was chewing a blade of grass, trying to hide a nervous tremble. Someone was wiping the already clean glass of a vision block with a rag. They were not waiting for speeches. They were waiting for instructions. "Load 2 ammunition supplies of armor-piercing shells," Kolobanov commanded. His voice was even, metallic. "Take a minimum of high-explosive shells. We are going hunting for armor." 2 ammunition supplies. This meant that every free centimeter inside the fighting compartment would be packed with shells. On the floor, against the walls, on their knees. Each slug weighing more than 6 kilograms. Heaviness, cramped conditions. In case of fire, no one would have time to get out of such a powder keg. But that worried no one. Something else worried them. Would there be enough shells to stop the avalanche? "Crews, check aiming mechanisms. Check communications. Take dry rations for 3 days," he continued. 3 days. An optimistic forecast. Usually, in such a battle, one lives for 30 minutes. Kolobanov unfolded his map on the armor of the lead vehicle. His finger, black with grease and ingrained dirt, slid along the line of the road and stopped at a point named Wojskowice, a crossroads. The perfect place for murder. "I will take a position here," he said, poking his finger at the map so hard the paper nearly tore. "I will block the direction to Marienburg. The rest, to positions according to the plan. Communications only for business. Do not clutter the airwaves." In the distance, from the direction of Luga, Clouds of dust were rising. The German war machine worked precisely, like a Swiss watch. Reconnaissance on motorcycles, then light tanks, then the main forces. They marched in parade formation, confident in their superiority, confident that the Russians had scattered, that resistance was broken. They were used to victories. They were used to seeing the backs of retreating men in their sights. They did not know that at some 50-odd kilometer mark of the road, not a retreat, but a concrete wall awaited them. Kolobanov looked at the sky, clear, blue, indifferent. The sun stood at its zenith, flooding the world with merciless light. Not a cloud, not a hint of saving rain that could wash out the roads and slow the enemy. Nature was on the side of the strong. That meant they would have to go against nature, against physics, against common sense. "Mount up!" The command cut the air. Hatches clanged. Motors roared, spewing blue-gray clouds of exhaust into the air. The earth trembled under the tracks. 5 KV-1 tanks, 5 doomed crews, moved to meet their fate. They were not driving to die. Dying is passive. They were driving to kill. Methodically, coldly, professionally. Because that was the only way to stop what was looming from the west. Only by turning their nerves into steel cables and their hearts into pistons. The dust raised by the tracks slowly settled, covering the grass with a gray film. Silence returned to the forest. But now this silence was deceptive, tense, ringing. It was the silence before an explosion that was supposed to rupture not only eardrums, but the very fabric of history. Hours remained until the meeting with the German column. The arithmetic of death had begun its countdown. Wojskowice, a point on the map where geography becomes an ally and the landscape turns into a weapon. Here the road leading from Marienburg makes a treacherous curve, as if nature itself decided to create ideal conditions for killing. On one side, a swampy lowland, boggy, unreliable, ready to suck down any equipment heavier than a cart. On the other, a dense forest, a wall of trunks and branches. For a tank column, this is not just a road, it is a corridor. A tunnel without a roof from which there is no exit to the side. Nowhere to turn. Impossible to turn around. An ideal fire sack. An engineering masterpiece created not by humans, but by a glacier thousands of years ago. But it had to be used right now. The crew of tank number 215 killed the engine. The silence that fell on the forest after the roar of the diesel seemed cottony, unnatural. Kolobanov climbed out of the hatch and jumped onto the spongy moss. His boots sank into the soft soil. Good. If a man gets stuck here, a German tank will simply drown. He walked along the road, estimating distances. 300 meters to the crossroads. 400 to landmark number 1, a solitary birch tree. 500, the limit of effective guaranteed penetration for most targets head-on. But he intended to hit closer. He intended to let them approach to pistol-shot distance. "Here," he said shortly, pointing to a spot among the trees, slightly to the side of the road, so that the sector of fire covered the entire arc of the turn. The hardest, most unheroic part of the war began. Earthworks. For the 47-ton behemoth KV-1 to become invisible, it had to be dug into the ground up to the turret. This is called a caponier. In infantry language, a trench. In tanker language, a grave from which you will shoot. Shovels cut into the soil with a dull, squelching sound. The clay here was heavy, damp, mixed with roots. This was not the loose sand of firing ranges. This was the greasy, dense earth of the Leningrad region, which resists every movement. 5 men, 5 pairs of hands. Gun Commander Andrei Usov, Senior Driver Mechanic Nikolai Nikiforov, Loader Nikolai Rodenkov, Gunner Radio Operator Pavel Kiselkov, and Kolobanov himself. Ranks did not exist here. Only the excavation norm existed. Cubic meters of earth that had to be shoveled before German scouts arrived. The heat was unbearable. Tunics turned dark with sweat in 10 minutes. Salty drops flooded their eyes, stung fresh abrasions on their palms. Breathing faltered, hearts pounded in their throats, but the pace did not drop. Stopping meant death. If the tank remained on the surface, its high profile would become a target for the first German gun. In a Caponier, however, the KV turns into a low, almost flat pillbox. Only the turret is visible, 150 millimeters of cast steel, from which shells will bounce like peas. "Dig deeper, under the track," Nikiforov rasped, wiping his forehead with a dirty sleeve. He knew the geometry of his machine best of all. He knew that if the belly sat firmly on the ground, the tank would become a stable platform. Recoil would not rock the hull, and the aim would not be thrown off after the first shot. "Chop the roots, don't spare them," Usov responded. His hands, accustomed to turning aiming flywheels with jeweler's precision, were now working an axe. He was chopping down bushes that blocked the view, but leaving those branches that could serve as natural camouflage. Hour after hour, the pit grew, consuming the men's strength. It was penal labor, muscles filled with lead, backs stiffened. No talk of high ideals, no thoughts of saving the motherland. Only one thought spun in their heads. One more shovel thrust. One more toss of earth, one more root. War here boiled down to the simplest physics. The deeper you dig in, the longer you live. It is the law of conservation of energy and mass, translated into the language of survival. When the ramp for entry was ready, Nikiforov took the driver's seat. The engine roared, throwing out a cloud of black smoke. The tank, clanking its tracks, slowly crawled backward into the prepared bed. Metal creaked, crushing the soil. The machine settled like a predator pressing itself to the ground before a jump. Now only the turret and the barrel of the F-32 gun stuck out above the parapet. But that was not enough. The tank had to be dissolved in the forest, made part of the landscape. The crew took up axes and knives. Everything was used. Spruce boughs, birch branches, clumps of withered grass. Camouflage is the art of deception. German gunners look for straight lines, unnatural angles, the glint of metal. The crew's task was to break the silhouette, turn the sharp edges of armor into a shapeless pile of forest debris. "Wrap the barrel," Kolobanov commanded, "so it doesn't glint in the sun, and blacken the muzzle brake with soot." Rodenkov, the youngest and strongest, hauled armfuls of branches. He was turning the formidable combat vehicle into the semblance of a huge haystack. Nets were thrown over the turret, branches stuck into special brackets. After an hour of work, even from 50 paces, it was hard to understand that 47 tons of death lay hidden under this pile of brushwood. Inside the tank, work was also underway. Rodenkov was stowing shells. The standard load was 114 rounds, but the order was, take double. Shells lay everywhere. On the floor of the fighting compartment, under the gunner's feet, in niches, strapped to brackets. Heavy, oily carcasses of armor-piercing slugs. Each shell is 6.5 kilograms of steel and explosives. Rodenkov knew each one by touch. He knew how to grab the casing correctly so as not to pinch his fingers when loading, how to turn the shell in the cramped turret to ram it into the breech in one fluid motion. Now he was building his own logistics of battle. First priority shells, at hand. Armor-piercing, closest. High-explosive fragmentation, further away, for dessert, for infantry and trucks. Tight as a coffin, Kyselkov grumbled, squeezing into his radio operator's seat. It's quieter in a coffin, Usov snapped back, checking the optics. They don't shoot there. Usov pressed against the sight. The vision block was clean. The crosshairs gripped the road tightly. He slowly rotated the flywheels, checking the smoothness of the turret's movement. Right. Left. Sector clear. Not a single branch blocked the view. He mentally drew lines of fire. Here is landmark number 1. 2 birches at the turn. Distance, 400 meters. We strike the lead here. Here is landmark number 2, a hazel bush, 300 meters. Here we will finish off those who try to drive onto the shoulder. Usov was not just looking. He was memorizing the picture of the world, overlaying a reticle grid on it. There would be no time to think in battle. Eyes must remember distances, hands, the number of flywheel turns. Inside the tank, even now, before the battle began, the temperature was approaching 30 degrees. The metal was heating up in the sun. The ventilation hummed, but circulated the same hot air, saturated with the smell of diesel and grease. And when the shooting starts, when the cannon throws spent casings smoking with powder fumes into the fighting compartment, this will become a branch of hell. Carbon monoxide is the silent killer of tankers. It makes your head ache, your eyes go dark, your movements become sluggish. But they tried not to think about that. Kolobanov went out onto the road again. He walked the path that the Germans were to travel. He looked at his position through the eyes of the enemy. Forest and forest. Nothing suspicious. A typical Russian landscape. A hummock overgrown with spruce. No one would suspect that this hummock could snap back with fire. Nikiforov, he called the mechanic, who was tinkering with the transmission through the access hatch. How's the engine? Eating oil, Comrade Senior Lieutenant. But it pulls. If we need to dash, it will pull. We won't dash. We will stand. Check the friction clutches, so the turn on the spot is smooth as butter. We'll have to spin. The day was drawing to a close. The sun, red and huge, crawled toward the horizon, painting the tops of the pines the color of rust. Mosquitoes whined in their ears, with a thin, tedious sound. This ringing was more annoying than the anticipation of battle. The men sat on the armor, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, the smoke of cheap tobacco mixed with the smell of pine needles. Conversations were short, chopped, about simple things, that the canned meat in the dry ration was fatty again, that back home, probably, it was raining right now, that a boot was rubbing. Not a word about death. It was a taboo, the superstition of professionals. If you speak of death, you call it. They ate in silence, sitting right on the armor, over the hatches. Chewed tough bread, washed it down with warm water from flasks. The water tasted of metal. Every sip was precious. Tomorrow there might be no water. Tomorrow there might be nothing at all. Kolobanov looked at his men. He did not see heroes from a poster. He saw tired men with dirty hands and faces smeared with soot. Usov, who could hit a squirrel in the eye with a tank gun, but eternally grumbled about the quality of tobacco. Rodenkov, who wrote poems in a notebook hidden in his bosom, but tossed 100-kilogram crates of shells like feathers. Nikiforov, who felt the engine better than his own heart. Kyselkov, who could fix a radio with a blow of his fist and a curse word. This was a single organism, 5 fingers clenched into a fist. And this fist now lay in the pocket of the forest, ready to strike. Night descended on Voiskovitsi like a heavy blanket. Darkness hid everything: the tank, the road, and the people. It became cool. Dew fell on the armor, making it slippery and wet, like the skin of an amphibian. The crew took their places inside the machine. They slept in shifts, lightly, with one eye open. Kolobanov did not sleep. He listened to the night. Any sound, the crack of a branch, the hum of a motor, the clang of metal, could become a signal. He sat in the commander's cupola, peering into the darkness that hid the future. Tomorrow had already arrived, but the sun had not yet risen to illuminate the stage of the coming tragedy. The trap was ready. The spring was wound. It only remained to wait for the beast to step on the pedal. The 19th of August, 1941, began not with sunrise. It began with vibration. At first, barely perceptible, like the trembling of the earth from a passing train, then growing, turning into a low, guttural hum. The forest, alive and singing with bird voices just a minute ago, froze. Nature gave way to mechanics. The hum approached from the direction of Marienburg. It was the sound of hundreds of pistons grinding fuel, the clang of thousands of track links gnawing the gravel of the road. The sound of impending catastrophe. Inside the KV-1 tank, buried in the ground up to its turret, time compressed into a tight spring. The crew sat in their places, turned into hearing. The engine was silent, so as not to give away the position ahead of time. In the silence of the fighting compartment, one could hear the ticking of the watch on the commander's wrist and the heavy, wheezing breathing of the loader Rudenkov. The air inside was stale, heavy, but no one opened the hatches. The armor was battened down. They were in a capsule, separated from the world by 75 millimeters of steel. Kolobanov pressed against the commander's periscope. The image in the optics trembled from the haze of the rising sun. First, the motorcyclists appeared. Reconnaissance. They sped past, raising clouds of dust, confident in their safety. Gray figures in helmets, machine guns on sidecars. They looked only forward, toward Leningrad. They did not look to the sides, at the brush-covered hills. Kolobanov did not give the command. To hit the scouts meant to scare off the big game. Let them go. Their death would find them later. Then, from around the bend, she crawled out, the head of the column. The tanks moved in a tight formation, side by side, distances minimal. The Germans were not expecting a fight. Hatches on many machines were open, commanders stuck out of turrets, exposing their faces to the wind. This was not a combat column. It was a parade of victors that had started too early. Kolobanov began to count. 1, 2, 3. Light Czech tanks, medium Mark IIIs, crosses on the sides, tracks polished to a shine by the long march through Europe and Russia. 43 machines. 43 steel boxes stuffed with confident men, ammunition, and gasoline. The commander's hand squeezed the throat microphone. His fingers went white. "Usov, do you see the lead?" Kolobanov's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if the Germans could hear him through the armor and the noise of their engines. "I see him," the gunner responded. The crosshairs of the sight slowly, smoothly settled on the center of the frontal armor of the first German tank. The distance was closing. 300 meters. 250. 200. "Wait," ordered Kolobanov. It was torture. Seeing the enemy in the crosshairs and not pulling the trigger. The Germans were entering the sector of fire, filling the entire space of the road. They were so close that in the optics one could make out the faces of the tankers, expressions of boredom and superiority. Kolobanov waited for the entire column to be drawn into the narrow throat between the swamp and the forest. When the tail of the snake would be in the same place as the head, in the kill zone. 150 meters, dagger strike distance, impossible to miss. The BR-350A armor-piercing shell at such a distance punches through German armor like cardboard, ignoring angles of inclination. "At the lead," Kolobanov exhaled. "Fire!" The tank shuddered. It was not the sound of a shot. It was the blow of a hammer on an anvil inside of which people were sitting. 76 millimeters of steel and explosives flew out of the barrel at a speed of over 600 meters per second. A moment, and the lead German tank stumbled. A shower of sparks, black smoke, and the machine ground to a halt, blocking the road. The turret jerked helplessly and froze. "Hit!" yelled Usov, not tearing himself away from the sight. "Shift fire! To the rear tank!" Kolobanov's command overrode the ringing in their ears. The KV turret, weighing tons, turned with surprising lightness. The electric drive hummed, catching up with the commander's thought. "Fire!" The second shot. The shell traced an invisible trajectory over the column and slammed into the stern of the last tank. The explosion of fuel tanks turned the German machine into a torch. Fire and smoke instantly cut off the path to retreat. The trap slammed shut. Hell began on the road. The German tankers, trapped in the narrow corridor, did not understand what was happening. They did not see the muzzle flashes. The KV's camouflage worked perfectly. The smoke from the gun dispersed in the bushes. It seemed to them that they had hit a minefield or come under an artillery battery strike. Tanks in the center of the column began to twitch. Someone tried to turn around, throwing tracks and exposing their sides. Someone tried to drive off the road and immediately, with a heavy squelch, sank into the swampy sludge up to the belly. The orderly formation turned into a pile of thrashing metal. "Armor-piercing," rasped Rudenkov, ramming another shell into the breach. The shutter clanged, cutting off the past from the future. "Ready! Center! Hit the ones moving! Fire!" Third shot. Fourth. Fifth. Now it was not a duel. It was an execution. Usov worked like a robot. Aim, shot, recoil, aim. He did not see burning men jumping out of hatches. He saw only silhouettes of tanks, vulnerable spots, the side, the turret ring, the gun mantlet. KV shells ripped open German armor, causing ammunition detonations. Turrets of German tanks were torn off their rings and tossed into the air like lids from boiling pots. The Germans finally realized where death was striking from. The turrets of the surviving tanks began to rotate feverishly, searching for the invisible enemy in the forest. Machine guns crackled, combing the brush, but it was blind fire, fire from fear. The first shells of the German guns hit the parapet in front of the KV, kicking up fountains of earth. They were searching, groping. "Don't twitch." Kolobanov's voice was the icy rod that held the crew together. "We work according to plan. Usov, don't fuss. Pick the fattest targets." Inside the tank, there was a roar that seemed about to burst skulls. Every shot of their own gun hit the ears. Every strike of a slug against the breech reverberated in the bones. Gunpowder fumes began to fill the fighting compartment, stinging eyes, settling as bitterness on lips. The fan howled strainingly, unable to cope with the smoke. "Fire!" Another German tank, attempting to bypass a burning comrade, took a shell in the side. The explosion tore the track, spun the machine across the road, finally blocking movement. Now it was a scrapyard. Burning iron, black, greasy smoke obscuring the sun, and screams that could not be heard over the roar of engines and the cannonade. The KV tank shuddered, spewing fire. Casings fell to the floor with a dull clang, rolling underfoot. Rudenkov had already thrown off his tunic. His torso glistened with sweat and oil. He grabbed hot casings with bare hands, tossed them into a corner, freeing up space, and immediately reached for a new shell. 6 kilograms. Another 6. Another 6. His muscles worked at the limit, but he did not feel fatigue. Adrenaline burned the lactic acid. "Landmark 2! Tank in the bushes!" shouted Kolobanov. Usov traversed the turret. A gray side with a cross flashed in the sight. The German was trying to hide, to go into the shadow of the trees. Too late. "Fire!" The shell entered right under the turret. The tank seemed to stumble. Brown smoke poured from the hatches. The crew did not get out. The first panic among the Germans passed. They were professionals who had marched through half of Europe. They spotted the flash. Dozens of barrels, 37 millimeters, 50 millimeters, turned toward the solitary hill. The air around the KV began to boil. Shells started drumming on the armor. Ping! Ping! Bang! The impacts were terrible, deafening. Inside the tank, it felt like you were sitting inside a huge bell being struck with a sledgehammer. "Hold!" screamed Kolobanov when another shell ricocheted into the sky, leaving a deep furrow on the armor. "You can't take us! It's peas! Usov, hit them!" German shells could not penetrate the frontal armor of Kliment Voroshilov. They left dents, chipped the paint, knocked off external equipment, but did not penetrate inside. 75 millimeters of Soviet steel, hardened in Ural factories, held the blow. It was the physics of superiority. The kinetic energy of German shells was absorbed by the mass and strength of the armor, but every blow knocked the wind out of the crew, forced them to curl into a ball. It was a test of the psyche, a check on the strength of the nervous system. To sit and wait. Will it penetrate or not? "Ready!" Rudenkov's shout. "Fire!" The column was burning. Black smoke rose to the sky in pillars, blocking the sun. The smell of burning metal, rubber, and flesh penetrated even through gas mask filters. The battle ceased to be tactics. It turned into mechanical work of destruction. A conveyor belt. Take a workpiece, a shell. Process, fire. Get a result, a burning wreck. And so on, time after time, as long as there is any movement in the crosshairs. But this was only the beginning. The echo of the first shots had not yet faded, and the mechanism of destruction had already reached full speed, demanding more and more fuel, shells, strength, nerves, and lives. 30 minutes. Only half an hour by earthly standards, time in which one can smoke a couple of cigarettes or walk from home to the factory gate. But here, in the iron belly of the KV-1 tank, time lost its usual rhythm. It did not flow. It dripped like molten lead. Every second had weight, density, and taste, the taste of powder fumes mixed with metallic dust. During this half hour, the crew ceased to be a collection of personalities. Fear, hope, memories of home, all went away. Only naked animal physiology remained, and automatism honed to the level of an unconditional reflex. Men turned into appendages to mechanisms, into living gears of a destruction machine working at maximum RPM. In the center of this hell was loader Nikolai Rudenkov. If the commander was the brain of the tank, and the gunner his eyes, then Rudenkov was his heart, pumping blood steel into the gun breech. The rate of fire depended on him. Life depended on him. In the cramped turret, choked with smoke, he performed his endless, terrible dance. Bend down, grab a shell, 6.5 kilograms of death slippery with grease. Lift, turn in the cramped space without hitting the commander's shoulder, without hitting the warhead against the breech. Ram into the barrel, strike with knuckles, driving the casing to the flange. Recoil to the side, pressing against the turret wall so the gun recoil doesn't crush ribs. and scream, tearing his voice, "Ready!" And so, time after time, dozens of times, a ton of metal moved by one pair of hands in mere minutes. Rodenkov's tunic had long since turned into a wet rag stuck to his back. Sweat didn't just run, it poured in streams, flooding his eyes, corroding his skin. The muscles of his back and arms seemed to ring with tension, like over-tightened strings. His fingers cramped, but they continued to grab casings as if they lived a life of their own. There was nothing heroic in this. It was heavy, dirty, exhausting physical labor, like the work of a stoker in the underworld. Only instead of coal, shells were tossed here, and the price for a mistake was instant death. The temperature inside the tank passed 50 degrees. The red-hot steel of the armor, heated by the sun and the blows of enemy shells, worked like oven walls. The running engine added heat from below, but the worst thing was the gases. The fan howled strainingly, trying to pull out the powder smoke, but it couldn't keep up with such a rate of fire. The fighting compartment filled with blue-gray fog. There was nothing to breathe. Lungs burned. A sweet, bitter taste of spent gunpowder stood in the mouth. Carbon monoxide slowly, imperceptibly killed the crew, causing nausea and dizziness. Men worked in a state of hypoxia, on the verge of losing consciousness, holding on only by adrenaline and rage. "Armor-piercing," Kolobanov rasped. He was no longer speaking. He croaked commands because his throat was dry to the point of cracking. "Armor-piercing up," Rodenkov echoed. The sound of the clanging shutter put a period in the dialogue. Andrei Usov, glued to the sight, did not notice the heat. His world had narrowed to a narrow sector of view. He saw only the crosshairs of threads and the grey silhouettes of German tanks thrashing in the fire sack. His work required surgical precision against the background of an earthquake. The tank shuddered from every shot, from every hit of an enemy slug on the armor. But Usov's hands remained steady. He turned the aiming flywheels softly, smoothly, targeting vulnerable points. Under the turret, in the side, in the engine compartment. He was not shooting at Germans. He was dismantling equipment. Methodically, part by part. "Shot!" The gun barked, ejecting a smoking casing backward. It fell to the floor with a crash, rolling, burning feet. Rodenkov kicked it into the corner, where a mountain of brass was already growing. "Hit! Burning!" Usov stated without emotion. There was no room for emotions. On the road before them, something indescribable was happening. 22 tanks of the first column had turned into scrap metal. Some blazed like bright torches, spewing black, greasy smoke in which the smell of burnt meat could be guessed. Others stood with torn open sides, with torn-off turrets lying nearby like discarded toys. Someone tried to snap back, rotating a surviving gun, but Usov's next shell put a bold period to this attempt at resistance. It was a conveyor belt of destruction, a mechanized slaughterhouse. The Soviet heavy tank worked like a giant hole punch, piercing the steel sheets of German machines, turning complex mechanisms into piles of mangled junk. Sound. The cacophony of battle merged into one continuous, oppressive hum. The blows of their own shots hit the eardrums from the inside. The blows of German shells on the armor sounded like hammer blows on a bell inside of which you were sitting. "Dong, dong," hummed the KV armor. Small fragments from observation devices rained down inside, scratching faces and hands. Kolobanov felt the floor vibrate under his feet, how every bolt in the machine's hull trembled. The tank groaned, taking kilograms of flying lead and steel, but held the blow. "Commander! Vision block shattered!" Nikiforov shouted. The driver-mechanic was blind. He sat below, in the very inferno, feeling the blows on the front plate, but not seeing the enemy. "Listen to commands," barked Kolobanov. "Keep the RPMs up. Don't stall." The Germans, recovering from the first shock, concentrated fire on the invisible killer. They saw flashes in the forest. Dozens of barrels beat on one point. The earth around the Caponier boiled with fountains. The trees, serving as camouflage, were sheared off as if by a razor. Branches, splinters, clods of earth flew in all directions. The camouflage vanished. Now the KV stood openly, a black block amidst ploughed earth. But it no longer mattered. The distance was such that neither side could miss. Only the Germans had armor of 30 to 50 millimeters, and Kolobanov had 75. And this math decided everything. Loader Rodenkov staggered. Colored circles swam before his eyes. Carbon monoxide was taking its toll. He grabbed the breech with his hand, burned his palm, but the pain brought him back to his senses. Can't stop. Stopping is death. He yanked the collar of his tunic. Buttons flew into the darkness. "Come on, Kolya, come on!" Usov shouted to him, not looking up from the sight. "Just a little more. That one, by the birch." Rodenkov drove another shell home. The shutter clanged. This sound became the rhythm of their life. As long as the shutter clangs, they are alive. As long as the gun shoots, they are not victims. Fire! The shell struck the turret ring of a German Mark III. The turret skewed, the barrel buried itself in the sky. No one climbed out of the hatches. Suddenly silence fell. A relative, ringing silence, in which only the crackle of burning German tanks and the heavy, wheezing breathing of the crew could be heard. The shooting died down. The first column ceased to exist as a combat unit. 22 machines were destroyed. The road was jammed with burning metal so tightly that it was impossible to pass. Rodenkov slid down the turret wall, sitting right on a pile of hot casings. His hands shook with a fine, nasty tremor that was impossible to calm. He looked at his palms, black, scraped, and oily, and did not recognize them. His chest heaved, sucking in poisoned air. Alive. Kizelkov exhaled, wiping a face on which eyes stood out as white patches. Kolobanov gave them no time for reflection. He understood. This was only the first act. The pause would be short. The Germans were regrouping. They would bring up artillery. They would call in aviation, or they would launch a second wave around, along the shoulders, right over the corpses of their comrades. War knows no pity for its own. "Check ammunition!" The commander's voice grated like metal on glass. "Rodenkov, how many armor-piercing left? Usov, inspect instruments. Nikiforov, water temperature?" The crew stirred. Overcoming the leaden heaviness in their bodies, overcoming nausea and ringing in their ears, they became a mechanism again. Rodenkov began shifting shells from distant racks closer to the gun. Every movement was a battle. The body screamed, "Enough!" But the brain gave the order, "Must." Kolobanov looked into the broken periscope. Smoke from the burning column obscured the view, but through gaps in the black veil, he saw movement. New shadows, new silhouettes. The second wave was approaching. They came angrier, more cautious, ready to kill. The respite ended before it began. The steel conveyor demanded new food. 21 tanks. The second wave did not march in parade formation. The Germans learned quickly. The price of the lesson was high. 24 burning skeletons of their comrades ahead. Now they moved differently, in jerks, from cover to cover. They were looking for death lurking in the forest, and they were determined to find it. If the first column died from surprise, the second came to kill consciously. They knew that somewhere there, among the birches and spruces, sat a Russian beast, and this beast had a thick hide. Kolobanov saw their maneuver. They were trying to bypass the jam on the road, sliding onto the shoulders, trying to find solid ground in the swampy lowland. It was a risk, but they had no choice. Standing still meant becoming a target. Moving forward, straight through the burning dump of metal, was impossible. Only a flank remained. But the earth of Wojskowice did not forgive mistakes. Heavy German machines spun their wheels, tearing up the sod, sinking into greasy mud. Engines roared at the limit, throwing out blue-gray clouds of exhaust. And then they saw him. Or, rather, calculated him. Smoke from the KV gunshots, despite the wind, unmasked the position. The flash of muzzle flame against the dark forest was like a beacon. "Target sighted! At 2 o'clock!" sounded in German headsets. 20 barrels turned to one point, and a squall began. If, up to this moment, Kolobanov's crew felt like hunters in an ambush, now they turned into game driven into a hole. The air around the tank turned into a whistling, howling hell. Shells hit the parapet, filling vision slits with earth. Shrapnel slashed branches, knocked down camouflage, scratched armor. But those were just flowers. Then the direct hits began. The impact of a slug on the KV-1 turret is unlike anything else. It is not a ring. It is the blow of a giant sledgehammer, from which, it seems, flesh separates from bone. The 47-ton tank shuddered with its whole body. Welds cracked, but held. Inside the turret, scale rained down. Fine steel dust hung in the air, getting into noses and throats. "Hold sector!" shouted Kolobanov, pressing the throat microphone to his neck. He did not hear his own voice. A continuous roar stood in his ears. Andrei Usov pressed against the sight. He tried to target a Mark III that was brazenly crawling toward them along the edge of the swamp. Distance closing, 300 meters, 200. At that moment, a German shell hit the gun mantlet, right next to the side aperture. The armor held. The vision block did not. The thick, multi-layered glass shattered into thousands of tiny sprays. Usov recoiled, covering his face with his hands. The scream of pain drowned in the roar of another hit. Sharp as razors, shards of glass and metal embedded themselves in his face, cut his forehead, cheeks, eyelids. Blood gushed instantly, flooding his eyes, mixing with dirt and sweat. "My eyes," he wheezed. "I can't see." In the darkness of the fighting compartment, no one could provide aid. There were no medics here. There was only steel and a task that no one had cancelled. "Wipe them," Kolobanov commanded harshly. It sounded cruel, but it was the only possible command. "Rodenkov, give him a rag. Usov, to the site." The gunner wiped his sleeve across his face, smearing blood. His left eye was swollen shut. The right saw the world through a red veil, but his hands remembered. The muscle memory of a professional turned out to be stronger than pain. He pressed against the backup sight again. "I see blurrily," he spat bloody saliva. "Guide me, Commander. Correct me." Below, in the driving compartment, mechanic driver Nikiforov was fighting his own battle with physics. Another shell hit the front plate, directly opposite his hatch. The impact was of such force that Nikiforov was thrown onto the levers. His head snapped. The helmet did not save him from hitting the metal. Consciousness clouded. Stars flashed in his eyes. A lump of nausea rose to his throat. Severe concussion. A dark trickle of blood flowed from his nose. The world around began to spin. Sounds became cottony, distant. "Kolya! RPMs!" The commander's voice broke through the cotton as if from far away. Nikiforov shook his head, trying to regain sharpness of vision. His hands shook, feet slipped off the pedals, but he gripped the levers with a death grip. The tank must not stall. If the motor stops, the turret will stop rotating, and they will turn into real estate. He did not see the enemy. He felt only the blows on the hull, each of which echoed with pain in the back of his head. He was the foundation of this fortress, and the foundation cracked, but did not crumble. Armor-piercing! Rudenkov was no longer shouting. He wheezed. His movements became jerky, mechanical. He slipped on spent casings, hit his knee on the breech, but didn't even wince. Pain became background. Shell in the barrel. Shutter closed. Fire! The KV shot blew the turret off a German tank that had gotten too close. The ammunition explosion tore the enemy machine apart from the inside. Ready! Next! Kolobanov rotated the commander's panorama, searching for targets. 11 tanks. 11 more steel boxes had to be turned into scrap metal. The crew worked on pure reflex. Usov, squinting his single-seeing eye, caught silhouettes in the crosshairs. Blood dripped from his chin onto the gun breech, hissed, and evaporated. Rudenkov, choking on fumes, fed shells at a pace that seemed impossible for a human. Kiselkov, the radio operator gunner, inserted a new disc into the machine gun and sprayed lead at German infantry trying to approach the tank with grenades under cover of armor. Inside the tank, there was a smell of blood. Fresh, metallic blood mixed with the smell of burnt insulation and gunpowder. It was the smell of war, concentrated in a volume of a few cubic meters. "Aiming broken!" Usov shouted. The turret rotation mechanism jammed from a shard hitting under the ring. The turret jerked, grinded, but did not go left. "Nikiforov, turn with the hull!" commanded Kolobanov. The mechanic, overcoming nausea and dizziness, yanked the left lever toward himself. The 47-ton behemoth obediently swayed, tracks digging up the earth. The gun barrel shifted a few degrees, catching the side of another Panzer in the sight. "Fire!" Hit. Black smoke. They didn't think about being heroes. They thought about wanting to drink, that their hands were slipping from sweat and blood, that the ringing in their ears was driving them crazy, that shells were running out. The second wave choked. The Germans, having lost another 11 machines, realized that a frontal assault was suicide. They began to crawl back, snapping back with fire, hiding behind a smokescreen. The KV stood in its caponier, pitted with marks like smallpox. The paint had burned off. The armor was covered with a layer of soot and dust. There was not a clean spot on it. Solid dents, chips, furrows from ricochets. But the armor was not pierced. Not once. Soviet steel passed the exam. Silence fell inside. Heavy, sticky. Only the dripping of oil somewhere in the transmission and the heavy breathing of the crew could be heard. Usov fell away from the sight, pressing a dirty rag to his face. It was already soaked through with red. "Intact?" asked Kolobanov. "Eyes are intact, I think," the gunner answered dully. "Skin and ribbons. It will heal." Nikiforov sat with his head dropped on his hands folded on the steering yoke. His shoulders shuddered. He was fighting vomit. "Kolya?" "Normal, Commander. Just ringing, like in church." Rudenkov sat on the floor amidst a pile of casings. He couldn't stand up. His legs wouldn't hold him. He simply stared at one point, at the soot-covered ceiling of the turret, and tried to breathe enough of that hot, poisonous air, which was now the only air available. The battle continued, but its peak had passed. 33 destroyed tanks. A number that did not fit in the head. A number behind which stood not luck, but penal labor and pain. The armor held. The men held. But men are not steel. Dents remain on armor and scars on people, and those on the outside were the most harmless. The main scars were inside, where fear and joy had burned out, leaving only emptiness and fatigue weighing 1,000 tons. "Water," someone rasped in the darkness. Kolobanov took out a flask. The water in it was hot, almost boiling. He took a sip, passed it to Usov. The flask went around the circle, a sip of life in the middle of the valley of death. They were alive, wounded, deafened, shell-shocked, but alive. And their tank, their fortress, was still ready to snap back with fire. The silence that descended on Voiskovitsi was heavier than the roar of battle. It was not the peaceful silence of the forest, but the dead, ringing silence of a cemetery. The hum in the ears did not pass. It became a background against which rare sounds of cooling metal were superimposed. The tank, just a minute ago a living organism shuddering from shots and the roar of the engine, froze. The diesel stalled. The fans stopped. Only the crackling of red-hot armor cooling in the evening air could be heard, like a huge cast-iron skillet removed from the fire. Hatches opened with a heavy scrape. The commander's head appeared first. Zinoviy Kolobanov inhaled the air. It smelled of burning, burnt rubber and the sweetish smell of decay, but compared to the poisonous atmosphere inside the fighting compartment, it was pure oxygen. He climbed out onto the armor. His legs did not obey him. Muscles clogged by hours of tension had stiffened. He jumped to the ground, staggered, and leaned against the track. The links were hot, almost burning. The rest began to climb out after him. Andrei Usov, holding onto the edge of the hatch, descended from the turret by touch. His face was a bloody mask baked into a crust of dirt. His left eye did not open at all. The right watered from the light, although the sun had almost set. Nikolai Rodenkov simply fell out of the loader's hatch and lay on the armor, arms spread, staring at the sky with an unseeing gaze. His chest heaved, greedily absorbing the coolness. Driver-mechanic Nikolai Nikiforov and radio operator Pavel Kiselkov climbed out through the front hatches, swaying like drunks. They swayed not from alcohol, but from severe concussion and poisoning by powder gases. Kolobanov tore himself away from the tank and looked at the road. The picture that opened to him was apocalyptic. It was not just a rout, it was total destruction. The road to Marienburg ceased to exist. Instead, a long trail of mangled metal, fire, and smoke stretched out. German tanks stood in the most unnatural poses. Some buried their noses in the ditch, sticking their sterns to the sky. Some lay on their sides, exposing their bellies and broken road wheels. Many had their turrets torn off, terrible evidence of ammunition detonation, when an explosion from inside tears apart a steel box like a cardboard package. Kolobanov took out a map case. His hands shook, the pencil danced on the paper. But the numbers in his head were clear, burned in. He began to count. 1, 2, 3. The professional's eye fixed every destroyed unit. 22 tanks in the first column, another 11 in the second wave attempting to flank the ambush. Total, 33. 33 enemy tanks destroyed by one crew in one battle. It was mind-boggling. It contradicted all manuals and all laws of probability. The entire 3rd Tank Company under Kolobanov's command, holding defense on this sector of the front, burned 53 German machines that day. But 33 of them were on the account of the crew of tank number 215. This was not just a success. It was the destruction of a Wehrmacht tank battalion by the forces of one Soviet heavy tank. But the price of this victory became obvious only when the crew was able to walk around their machine. The KV-1 stood in the Caponier, black with soot, looking like a beast that survived a forest fire. At first, it seemed the tank was intact, but when they got closer, they saw the terrible truth. The armor was not smooth. It resembled a lunar landscape or a giant grater. Usov ran his hand along the side of the turret. His fingers stumbled upon a deep, jagged gouge. The melted edges of the metal were sharp as a razor. "Look, Commander," he said hoarsely. "Just a little more, and they would have punched through." Next to the first mark was a second, a third, a 10th. The entire side, the entire turret, the front plate were peppered with hit marks. They started counting, but quickly lost track. 100, 110, 120. In the end, they counted over 156 direct hits from armor-piercing shells. 156 times death knocked at their doors. 156 times German slugs hammered the steel, trying to find a weak spot, burn through, break through, kill those sitting inside. 75 millimeters, Nikiforov said quietly, stroking the frontal armor as one strokes a beloved dog. 75 millimeters of life. It was the physics of salvation. German shells of 37 and 50 millimeter caliber simply did not possess enough kinetic energy to penetrate this thickness of hardened steel. They left deep craters, knocked out chunks of metal, but did not go through. Some slugs stuck in the armor, sticking out of it like thorns, fused tightly into the body of the tank. It was an eerie sight. The tank took on tons of kinetic energy intended to tear human flesh. But such shelling could not pass without a trace. The turret was indeed jammed. Another shell hit exactly under the ring, deforming the rotation circle. Now the gun looked strictly forward. It was impossible to turn it, either by electric drive or manually. If the Germans had launched a third attack from the flank, the KV would have turned into a defenseless target. Vision blocks were shattered to smithereens. Instead of glass, black holes gaped. Observation devices swept away by shrapnel. The machine gun barrel was bent into an arc. Several road wheels were cracked. The rubber tires burned off, exposing bare metal. The tracks held on a wing and a prayer. Many track pins were knocked out. The tank was crippled. It took a blow that should have destroyed an entire division. It was beaten, wounded, blinded, but it was not killed. It fulfilled its function. It remained an impenetrable cocoon for 5 men. Rudenkov picked up a shard of a German shell from the ground, a heavy, hot, jagged piece of steel. He looked at it, then at the tank armor, then at his hands. There was no triumph in his gaze. There was only dull, animal incomprehension. How? How can one survive at the epicenter of an explosion? Statistics said they should have died in the 10th minute of the battle. The logic of war said that one tank cannot stop an army. But here they stand, alive, breathing, hearing the ringing in their ears, feeling pain in their muscles. "Well, men?" Kolobanov lit a cigarette. The match broke in trembling fingers. The second lit. He inhaled deeply until he coughed. Alive. This word sounded strange, not like a statement of fact, but like a question. Alive? After being hit by a hammer 150 times? "Armor is quite the thing," said Kiselkov, kicking a German slug stuck in the soil. "Armor is us," Kolobanov corrected him. He looked not at the tank. He looked at his crew. At these exhausted faces black with soot. At Usov with a swollen eye. At Rudenkov, who could barely stand on his feet from fatigue. At Nikiforov, who had a thin trickle of blood running from his ear. The KV-1 tank was a masterpiece of engineering, a monster created at the Kirov plant for a great war. But without these people, it would be just a pile of expensive scrap metal. It was their will, their reflexes, their ability to endure superhuman loads that made this steel work. The tank held because the people held. The armor didn't bend because they didn't bend. They stood silently, leaning against the warm, pockmarked armor of their savior. The knock on the hull, a dull, dense sound, was for them now the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of reliability, the sound of a wall separating life from death. They survived the meat grinder. They did the impossible. They stopped time and the German army. But at that moment, they did not feel like heroes. They felt like workers who had just finished the hardest, dirtiest, and most terrible shift of their lives. And this shift was over. But the factory hadn't gone anywhere. War still stood around them, smoking, destroyed, but alive and hungry. Adrenaline is the strongest drug the human body produces. It makes the heart pump blood at a furious speed. It makes vision sharp as an eagle's and muscles hard as steel. It turns off pain, fear, and doubt. But this loan taken from one's own physiology has terrible interest rates, and the payback comes the moment the last shot fades. It is called the crash, the chemical collapse of the organism. When Zinoviy Kolobanov's crew stood by the cooling machine, looking at the burning horizon, they felt no joy of victory. They felt like life had been pumped out of them. It was a state of absolute, ringing emptiness. Inside, a black hole formed that sucked in all emotions, leaving only dull, aching fatigue. Hands that 10 minutes ago rotated flywheels with jeweler's precision and threw heavy shells now shook with a fine, humiliating tremor. Legs buckled, as if bones had turned into cartilage. Kolobanov took out a cigarette. The paper stuck to his lip. Tobacco spilled out. He struck a match, once, twice. The flame danced. Andrei Usov, the gunner, silently held out his lighter. The click of the wheel sounded unnaturally loud in this cottony silence. They smoked. The smoke, acrid and bitter, penetrated their lungs, slightly dulling the smell that hung over the battlefield. The smell. That was the worst part. It wasn't the smell of gunpowder or diesel that tankers were used to. The wind carried a heavy, sweetish, nauseating odor from the destroyed column. The smell of roasted meat. The smell of burning organic matter. There, in those 33 steel boxes, and between them, people were burning. Enemies, occupiers, those who came to this land to kill. But that didn't make the smell a scent of roses. It was the smell of death, multiplied by 200. 200 people. A battalion. That was exactly how many, by the most modest estimates, were left lying on this piece of highway and in roadside ditches. Tank crews, motorcyclists, infantry riding on armor. Kolobanov looked at the smoke pillars rising to the sky, and in his head, accustomed to tactical schemes, this number suddenly surfaced. Not as a statistic in a report, but as a mountain of corpses. He, a senior lieutenant of the Red Army, and his 4 comrades had just, in 1 hour, destroyed the population of a small village. This is not a triumph. In movies, they show heroes shouting, "Hurrah!" hugging, throwing helmets in the air. Here, in real war, killing is heavy work that leaves dirty oil stains on the soul. They cannot be washed away with alcohol or erased by time. Usov, who pressed the trigger with his own hands, sending death 33 times, stood with his head down. He did not look toward the enemy. He looked at his boots, covered with a layer of clay and soot. What was he thinking about? About how successfully the shell entered under the turret of the lead tank? Or about how a burning tanker tried to get out of the hatch of that Mark III but didn't make it? A gunner is a special caste. He sees death in the face. Through the optics of the sight, the enemy becomes close, almost intimate. You see not just a tank, you see details. An open hatch, the hand of a commander waving a flag, the turn of a head. And then you press the pedal, and what was alive and complex turns into a ball of fire. Usov was a professional. He felt no pity for the enemy. The Germans came here themselves. But seeing the result of one's work in such quantity is a test for sanity. His eye, swollen and puffy from the blow, twitched. He blinked, trying to erase the picture imprinted on his retina, but the picture stood before his eyes, the conveyor of destruction he controlled. There are a lot of them, Rudenkov wheezed. He sat on the track, hanging his head between his knees. He was vomiting. His stomach, empty and twisted by spasms, was turning inside out. It was a reaction to overexertion and carbon monoxide, but also to the realization of what had happened. He, Rudenkov, loaded this death into the cannon. He was the feeder in this meat grinder. A lot, Kolobanov echoed. But there are more of us. This phrase sounded strange. Us, meaning whom? 5 exhausted men? Or that force which stood behind their backs? The psychology of heroism is a complex thing. At the moment of battle, you are not a hero. You are a function. You are part of a mechanism. There is no fear. There is only a task: survive and destroy. Fear comes later. It rolls in a cold wave when you realize how thin the line was. 156 hits. If just one German gunner had aimed a little higher or a little lower, if just one shell had found a crack in the armor, they would now be part of this nauseating smell, part of this burning statistics. The realization of one's own mortality, which passed a millimeter from the temple, fell on their shoulders like a lead slab. They felt like killers. Not in the criminal sense, no. In the biblical sense, if you will. War lifts the ban on killing, makes it a duty, a valor. But human nature resists. The psyche sets up blocks to keep from going crazy. Now these blocks were crumbling. They looked at the work of their hands and experienced horror. Not from what they did, but from the scale of what was done. Burning iron stretched to the very horizon. It was a picture of hell painted by their hands. Water? Nikiforov asked again. There was no water. Flasks were empty. Mouths were so dry that tongues felt like sandpaper. Thirst was tormenting, but strangely enough, it tied them to reality. It reminded them that they were still biological objects needing resources, not ghosts. Kolobanov forced himself to tear away from contemplating the catastrophe. He had to remain the commander. Even now, when he wanted to just fall face down in the moss and forget this day. "Look around," he commanded. His voice was creaky, alien. "Check personal weapons. Germans might crawl up with infantry." It was the correct command. It returned them to formation. It forced the brain to work in the habitual threat-reaction mode. The crew stirred. Slowly, like in a dream, they began to take out TT pistols, check magazines. Kizelkov pulled out discs from the machine gun. "Empty, Commander. Shot everything." Then grenades. "Keep them at hand." They waited. Silence pressed on the ears. The sun finally set, and the glow of fires became the only source of light. Crimson reflections danced on the tankers' faces, making them look like demons. Shadows from trees lengthened, turning into black tentacles. The forest, which had been an ally during the day, now seemed hostile, full of hidden threats. Every tree could hide a sniper, every bush a group of saboteurs. Nerves stretched to the limit rang. Any rustle made them flinch. But no one came. The Germans were in shock. They could not believe that one tank had caused such a rout. They thought they had run into a fortified area, an anti-tank gun battery, a minefield. They needed time to realize the losses, regroup, count the dead. And while they counted, Kolobanov's crew sat on the armor of their Kliment Voroshilov and smoked one cigarette after another, trying to scour the screams and explosions from memory. It was loneliness of the highest grade. 5 people against the whole world. There was no connection with the regiment. The antenna had been sheared off by shrapnel at the very beginning of the battle. They didn't know what was happening on the flanks. Did the Germans break through somewhere else? Was Leningrad alive? Did their company, their battalion, still exist? Maybe they were the last Soviet soldiers on this line. This thought, cold and sticky, crept into everyone's head, but no one voiced it. That would be an admission of weakness, and weakness now was inadmissible. Kolobanov looked at his watch. The glass was broken, the hands frozen. Time stopped for this place. Here, at the crossroads under Voiskovitsi, August 1941 remained forever. This smell of burning and blood remained here forever. And they, 5 tankers, also left part of their souls here. They would leave here if they were lucky, but they would never be the same. He who has seen armor melt and a human burn can no longer look at the world through the eyes of an ordinary person. That heavy, gloomy emptiness settled in their gaze forever. The imprint of the abyss into which they looked and which looked into them. "Need to report," said Kolobanov, throwing away a cigarette butt. "Need to find the connection." He understood that this battle was not just a fight. It was a document. It was a fact of history that needed to be recorded. Otherwise, no one would believe. Otherwise, these 200 corpses and 33 tanks would become just a statistical error of war. And they must not be an error. They are the price the enemy paid for attempting to walk on this land. And this price had to be presented for payment. Presented to headquarters, command, history. But for now, they were alone. 5 shadows on the armor of a crippled giant amidst a sea of fire and death. And in this silence, interrupted by the crackle of burning machines, not pride was born, but a heavy, silent understanding. They did their job. Terrible, dirty, necessary work. And tomorrow, they would have to do it again. If tomorrow comes. War has 2 faces. One, dirty, soot-covered, with mad eyes and bloody calluses, looking at the world through a cracked vision block. The second, clean-shaven, smelling of cologne and printing ink, bent over a map in a headquarters dugout. Between these 2 faces lies a chasm that is difficult to bridge, even with the most honest report. Headquarters is a kingdom of paper, telephone calls, and arrows on maps. Here, death is a digit in the losses column, and victory is the shift of the front line by 2 centimeters of pencil lead. And when trench truth bursts into this world of paper logic, a short circuit occurs. Zinoviy Kolobanov entered the regimental headquarters not as a hero, but as a ghost. His tunic was stiff with dried sweat and machine oil. His face was a gray mask on which only circles around the eyes shone white, traces from headset goggles. He swayed. The earthen floor of the dugout seemed to him like the deck of a ship in a storm. The heavy concussion and hours of vibration of the tank hull were taking their toll. In the headquarters, business bustle reigned. Field telephones crackled, typewriters clattered. Operations officers drew diagrams, trying to plug holes in the defense, which were becoming more numerous by the hour. The appearance of the third company commander caused silence. They looked at him as a man who had returned from the dead. By all calculations, Kolobanov's 5 tanks should have burned in the morning. They were sent to plug a breach of an entire division, sent to slaughter to win a couple of hours. And he returned. And not just returned, but came with a report. Kolobanov stood before the regimental commander's desk. He tried to stand at attention, but his back wouldn't bend. He put a hand to his headset, which he hadn't taken off. Without it, he heard almost nothing. A continuous ringing stood in his ears. "Comrade Colonel, order executed. Enemy stopped. Tank column destroyed." The regimental commander raised tired eyes, red from insomnia, to him. He saw before him an exhausted officer who was possibly delirious from concussion. "Report enemy losses," he threw out dryly, preparing to write down the number 3 or 5. 33 tanks. Kolobanov's voice was hoarse, like the grinding of metal. "Total destroyed by the company, 53 units. 33 by the crew of my tank." The pencil in the colonel's hand froze. Dead silence hung in the dugout. Staff officers exchanged glances. On their faces read not admiration, but skepticism mixed with pity. 33? That's impossible. That's delirium. That doesn't happen. The manuals of the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, the tactical and technical characteristics of the equipment, common sense, everything spoke against this figure. One tank cannot destroy a battalion. It is physically impossible. Ammunition load, reload time, probability of hitting, return fire. The math of war was against Kolobanov. "You are shell-shocked, Senior Lieutenant," the Chief of Staff said softly but firmly. "You need to go to the infirmary. Sleep, come to your senses. Then you will write a report. No need for fantasies. We understand. The battle was heavy. This was scarier than German shells." Disbelief. A bureaucratic wall against which truth smashed. Kolobanov felt a dull anger boiling inside. He had just come out of hell where iron burned and skin melted, and here, in silence and relative safety, his words were weighed on apothecary scales and found counterfeit. "I am not shell-shocked," Kolobanov spoke slowly, separating words. "I am reporting a fact. 33 carcasses on the road near Voiskovitsi. You can count them. The road is blocked. The Germans will not pass." There was so much leaden heaviness in his voice, so much confidence of a man who had seen death in the face, that the colonel hesitated. Paper endured everything, but the eyes of this tanker did not lie. In them stood the reflection of burning crosses on German armor. "Verify," the regimental commander threw out shortly. "Chief of Intelligence, take a car, a camera. Kolobanov, you go with them. Show your trophies." The trip to the battle site became an excursion to the underworld. The staff car bounced over bumps, approaching the crossroads. The closer they got, the more distinct the smell of burning became. And then the panorama opened up. The staff officers got out of the car and froze. They were used to seeing war on maps, in the form of blue and red diamonds. Here, war appeared before them in the flesh. A gigantic cemetery of equipment. Black, twisted skeletons of German tanks stretched for hundreds of meters. Some were still smoking, others had cooled, turning into monuments to their own demise. Torn-off turrets, broken tracks, hulls burned to the ground. The chief of intelligence walked along the column, moving his lips. He was counting. 1, 2, 10, 20. He stumbled over debris, bypassed craters, but kept counting. He reached the turn where the lead machine stood and turned around. His face was pale. He looked at Kolobanov, who stood by his shell-pitted KV, smoking and staring into the void. The scout's look changed. The arrogance of a staff worker disappeared from it. Fear and awe appeared. "All correct, Comrade Colonel," he reported quietly, returning. 33 machines. Confirmed. This is a slaughter. The regimental commander walked to Kolobanov's tank. He ran a hand along the armor, feeling the roughness of the dents. 156 marks. 156 times death kissed this crew and retreated. The colonel understood the scale of what had happened. This was not just a successful ambush. It was a miracle created by the hands of professionals. If these 33 tanks had broken through, tonight they would have been on the outskirts of Leningrad. Kolobanov and his men didn't just burn iron. They bought the city time, the most precious currency of war. "Heroes," the colonel exhaled. He took off his cap, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You will all be heroes. I am sending a recommendation up today for Hero of the Soviet Union to the entire crew. And you, Zinoviy," he stumbled, picking words, "you need a monument in your lifetime." Words about awards sounded solemn, but for the crew, they were a distant echo. They stood next to their machine, dirty, deafened, devastated. The star of the hero is a piece of gold on a red ribbon. It is beautiful, honorable, but it will not bring back hearing, remove the ringing in the head, or erase the smell of burning meat from memory. "I served the Soviet Union," Kolobanov answered wearily. It was a reflex, a regulation phrase behind which hid a simple human desire to fall down and sleep for 2 days. Different work began at headquarters. Now the number 33 became official. Telephonists shouted into receivers, transmitting the report to division headquarters, then army. A red pencil on the map boldly crossed out the blue arrow of the German offensive. Danger eliminated. Breakthrough closed. The bureaucratic machine of war digested this fact and started the award process. Clerks typed on keys, filling out award sheets. Displaying exceptional courage and heroism. Engaging in unequal combat. Inflicted crushing damage on the enemy. Paper turned blood and sweat into lofty words. Bureaucratic language smoothed corners, removed details, leaving only the glossy facade of the feat. The award sheets didn't write about how Rudenkov vomited from fumes, how Usov wiped blood from his eyes to see the sight, how Nikiforov pissed his pants because it was impossible to leave the tank. There was only heroism and mastery. Major General Baranov, having received the report, also didn't believe it at first. But facts were stubborn things. Photographs of the burning column lay on the front command's table. Leningrad got a respite. The German tempo was broken. The enemy realized there would be no easy walk, that every kilometer of Soviet land would have to be paid for with dozens of burned tanks. It was a psychological turning point. The myth of the invincibility of the Panzerwaffe cracked right here, on a narrow road near Voiskovitsi. Kolobanov returned to the crew. "Well?" asked Usov, applying a cold flask to his eye. "They believed," the commander nodded. "Promised heroes. Heroes." Kiselkov grinned. "We could use some hot grub and a bath." That was the salt of soldiers' truth. Awards are for descendants, for newspapers, for a parade tunic. And right now, They needed simple human warmth. The war wasn't over. The destroyed column was just an episode. Tomorrow, new tanks would come. Aviation would fly in. Infantry would come. Bureaucracy recorded the success, filed the folder, and demanded new results. "Prepare the machine," said Kolobanov, looking at the darkening forest. "Sappers might come at night, sleep in turns." The paper front was won. The feat was recognized, documented, stamped. But the real front, iron and bloody, hadn't gone anywhere. It stood 100 meters away, hidden by darkness and breathed hatred. And no paper, no order with a seal could protect against an armor-piercing shell that was possibly already lying in the breech of the next German tank preparing to fire. Glory in war lives exactly until the next artillery barrage. In headquarters, they were still finishing award sheets, but for Zinoviy Kolobanov's crew, the war had already dropped the mask of a victor and returned to its usual gray, exhausting state. No orchestras, no rest in the rear with white sheets and hot soup. The reality of 1941 did not provide vacations for heroes. There was only one resource they won with their battle: time. And command did not intend to spend this time on banquets. The order came routinely, like a work order for chores. Take up defense near Krasnogvardeysk, then retreat to the Pulkovo Heights. The Leningrad front was shrinking like shagreen leather. The blockade ring was closing, and every tank capable of shooting was worth its weight in gold. Even one as crippled as number 215. They drove to the new position not as victors, but as workers of war being transferred from one burning shop to another. The tank wheezed. Broken road wheels knocked, causing teeth grinding. The turret, jammed by a German shell, looked strictly forward, turning the formidable, maneuverable machine into a self-propelled gun with a limited sector of fire. Driver-mechanic Nikolai Nikiforov now aimed the gun with the tracks. To shift the aim a degree to the left, he had to yank the levers, forcing the multi-ton behemoth to turn in the mud. It was torture for the transmission, and torture for the driver, but it was the only way to stay in the fight. Pulkovo Heights, the last line. Behind, the domes of St. Isaac's Cathedral, the spires of the Admiralty, a city of millions that had already begun to plunge into the icy hell of the blockade. Ahead, Germans, who already saw the city in binoculars. Here the war stopped. It ceased to be maneuverable. The blitzkrieg choked, and a positional meat grinder began. Kolobanov's tank was dug into the ground. Shovels again, clay again, bloody calluses again. But now it was not a temporary trench for an ambush. It was a place of permanent deployment. The tank turned into a long-term firing point, an armored firing point. There was no fuel. Diesel became the blood of the city, and it was saved for generators and bread trucks. Tanks had their rations cut. Engines were shut off. Now warmth left the steel boxes. The autumn of 1941 was early, damp, piercing. The metal of the hull, which in August heated up to 50 degrees, now drew the last warmth out of the men. The tank became a refrigerator. Walls were covered with frost. Condensate dripped from the ceiling, turning the floor of the fighting compartment into an icy puddle. Routine began. The scariest word in war. A feat is a flash, a moment when you act at the limit. Routine is endless, viscous survival that grinds down the psyche slower but surer than fear. Days merged into one gray strip, rising in darkness, meager breakfast, a ration of bread that became smaller every day and more clay-like in taste, boiling water smelling of metal. Observation. The Germans were close. Their trenches cut the slopes of the hills. Sniper duels became the norm. German observers watched the tank around the clock. As soon as one of the crew stuck out of a hatch to gulp fresh air or throw out a casing, a click followed immediately, and a bullet ricocheted off the armor with a squeal. They lived in a steel prison. They went to the toilet in a shell casing because going outside meant death. They slept in a heap, pressing against each other for warmth, covering themselves with oily pea coats. The smell of unwashed bodies, chlorine, gun oil, and cheap tobacco became the atmosphere of their existence. The heroism of 33 destroyed tanks dissolved in this everyday life. Here, on the Pulkovo Heights, every day someone performed a feat, and every day someone died. Death lost its tragedy. It became statistics. A gunner from a neighboring company was killed when he went for water. A signalman laying cable to Kolobanov's tank was wounded by a mortar shard. These were just facts recorded in the combat log. No one tore their hair out. Emotions atrophied. Only tired anger and the desire to survive until evening remained. Kolobanov looked at his men and saw how war was eating them alive. Andrei Usov, the sniper gunner, grew gaunt. Gray skin stretched over his cheekbones. His eyes, which used to burn with excitement, went dim. He sat for hours at the site, peering into the gray gloom, waiting for movement. Nikolai Rodenkov, the giant loader, began to cough. A heavy, barking cough shook his chest. The dampness of the tank was doing its job. But he didn't complain, didn't ask for the infirmary. There, in the rear, it wasn't better. Here, at least, there was armor. Sometimes an artillery barrage began. The Germans methodically, by quadrants, plowed the height with heavy calibers. The earth around the tank turned into a lunar landscape, crater upon crater. Shrapnel drummed on the armor like hail on a tin roof. Ping! Bam! Rumble. Inside the tank, every such blow echoed with pain in the ears. But they didn't even flinch. They got used to it. The tank became their shell, their second skin. They grew together with the machine. They knew every sound it made, every creak. They knew that if a shell landed nearby, the tank would rock like a boat on a wave. If a direct hit, there would be a ring. If a penetration, they didn't think about that. Ammunition was saved, every shot, only at a confirmed target. Now there was no luxury of firing a double load in half an hour. Shells were brought up rarely, at night, on sleds or drags, because trucks bogged down or blew up. Rodenkov accepted these shells like a sacred gift. He wiped them with a rag, placed them in the ammo rack, talking to them. These were their only arguments in the dispute with the enemy. The blockades squeezed the throat with hunger. First, canned meat disappeared, then sugar. Then the bread ration was reduced. The tank crew received the frontline ration, but even that was such that the stomach constantly cramped with hunger spasms. Thoughts of food displaced thoughts of women, home, the future. Bread was dreamed of, warm, black, with a crispy crust. Waking up, they chewed rusks, soaking them in boiling water, and tried to trick the body. Belts were tightened to new holes. Tunics hung like sacks. But the strength of spirit is a strange thing. The thinner the bodies became, the tougher the character became. The superfluous fell away. Only a skeleton of will and hatred remained. Kolobanov understood. This was for a long time. This is not a short skirmish. This is a war of attrition. Who will outsit whom? Who will out-endure whom? The KV-1 tank, the pride of Soviet tank building, created for breakthroughs and deep raids, stood motionless, covered with snow, turned into a steel drift. But this drift was alive. Inside beat 5 hearts. Inside burned a dim bulb of sight illumination. and the gun muzzle looked west without blinking. Zinoviy Grigorievich wrote letters, rarely, briefly. Alive, healthy, beating the fascists. He didn't write that the mechanic's feet were rotting from dampness, didn't write that his head spun from hunger, didn't write that 33 burned tanks now seemed like a dream from another life. Those at home should know that everything is normal, that the front holds. This lie for salvation was part of their duty. They were atlases holding the sky over Leningrad, and atlases are not supposed to complain about the weight of the burden. Sometimes political officers or correspondents made their way to them. They were looking for heroes. They wanted to hear beautiful stories about that battle near Voiskovitsi. Kolobanov answered in monosyllables, dryly. He didn't want to stir up the past. What does that battle matter if the enemy is still here? If he sees German soldiers in binoculars smoking and laughing? Victory is when the enemy is gone. And while the enemy exists, any heroism is just unfinished work. Winter was coming into its own. The armor froze through. Touching metal with a bare hand meant a burn. The tank was covered with a crust of ice. They became ice people, frozen in time, without a past and without a future. There was only an endless present, sight, cold, hunger, waiting. The unique feat dissolved in the general mass of war, like a drop of blood dissolves in the ocean. They became just some of the thousands of defenders of the city, faceless, stubborn, mortal. Commander, Fritz brought up a kitchen. Usov's voice was colorless. Distance 800. Kolobanov pressed against the instruments. Smoke from a field kitchen. The Germans are having lunch. They have hot soup. They have schnapps. Fragmentation, he commanded. It wasn't revenge. It was work. Depriving the enemy of lunch meant lowering his combat capability. The shot tore the silence of the frosty day. The explosion scattered the kitchen and the line of soldiers with mess tins. Hit, Usov stated indifferently. They didn't rejoice. They just put another check mark in the endless bill they would have to pay for almost 3 more years. The war didn't end. It just became a way of life. The history of wars is written twice. The first time, with blood on snow and oil on armor, when people burn and metal melts. The second time, with ink in quiet offices where people sit who have never heard an eardrum burst from a shell impact. And this second history is often crueler than the first, because in it, a feat can be cancelled with one stroke of a red pencil. The recommendation for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for Zinoviy Kolobanov and his crew lay on a table in the front headquarters. The figure 33 destroyed tanks looked provocative. It hurt the eyes of staff workers. It seemed impossible, fantastic, invented. In offices, they didn't believe in miracles. They believed in ammunition consumption norms and average statistical gun efficiency. 33? One crew? Doesn't happen. Someone up there decided that such a figure in the award sheet was a mistake, or worse, a brazen lie to boost morale. The red pencil lowered onto the paper. The title, Hero of the Soviet Union, was crossed out. Over it, in dry clerical handwriting, was written, Order of the Red Banner. Andrei Usov, whose eyes had leaked out from strain and shrapnel, received the Order of Lenin. Nikolai Nikiforov, the Order of the Red Banner. The others, Orders of the Red Star and medals. The Gold Star, which rightfully belonged to Kolobanov, dissolved in the inkwell of bureaucracy. The feat that saved Leningrad from a lightning capture was recognized as significant, but not plausible enough for the state's highest award. This is how the arithmetic of mediocrity works. Heroism going beyond the understanding of a desk strategist causes not admiration, but suspicion. Kolobanov didn't argue. He was a soldier. An order is an order. They didn't swallow carbon monoxide and burn in iron boxes for awards. But somewhere deep inside, where a person keeps a sense of justice, a scar remained, as rough and unhealing as the scars on the armor of his KV tank. The war ended, but for the crew of 215, it did not pass without a trace. Fate scattered them like a blast wave scatters shrapnel. Nikolai Rudenkov, that same loader who tossed tons of death with his own hands, did not live long. His heart, strained by the overloads of that battle, stopped. War caught up with him already in peacetime, presenting the bill for those 30 minutes of inhuman tension. He burned out like a fuse that took too much current to save the whole circuit. Andrei Usov, a sniper from God, a man-eye, plunged into darkness. The vision that allowed him to hit a squirrel in the eye and find vulnerable points in German armor from a kilometer away faded. The last thing he saw so brightly and clearly was the crosshairs of the sight and burning German crosses. Darkness became his eternal companion. The man who saw war in the most terrible details spent the rest of his life by touch. It was a cruel irony of fate, to take the main tool from the master as payment for his mastery. Zinoviy Kolobanov survived the war. He continued to serve, then went into the reserves. He moved to Minsk, worked at an auto plant, an ordinary man in work overalls. In the crowd of passers-by, no one recognized in him that steel commander who, in August 1941, personally stopped a Wehrmacht tank armada. He didn't like to talk about the war. At the plant, many didn't even know that this silent, modest man was a legend. He lived in a small apartment, went to the store for bread, stood in lines. Heroism in everyday life does not convert into privileges if there is no corresponding paper with a seal. The feat at Wojskowice fell under the heading Secret for many decades, and then under the heading Oblivion. In history textbooks, they wrote about army battles, generals, strategic strikes. No room was found for one specific battle of 5 men. This story stood out too much from the general canvas. It was too wrong, implausible. For a long time, there was nothing at the battle site. Just a crossroads, overgrown with grass and bushes. Nature quickly heals the Earth's wounds. Craters filled in. Rusty debris of German tanks were dragged away for remelting. Silence returned to the forest, hiding the echo of that cannonade. Kolobanov died in 1994 in Minsk. He never became a hero of the Soviet Union. The country he defended disappeared from the map of the world before he did. He left quietly, without loud obituaries in central newspapers, without cannon salutes over his grave. Just an old soldier left, who had done his duty to the end. It would seem this is the finale. A bitter, unjust finale to a tragedy. A story about how the system grinds down its saviors. But there is one thing stronger than bureaucracy, stronger than oblivion, and even stronger than death. It is the result. Look at the map. Find St. Petersburg. This city stands. Its avenues are straight, its palaces majestic. People who speak Russian walk along its embankments. Children are born in this city who have never heard the sound of an air raid siren. This city exists, and in the fact that it exists lies a huge, heavy as an armor-piercing shell, share of the labor of Zinoviy Kolobanov's crew. If on the 19th of August 1941 they had flinched, if they had let those tanks through, if they had decided that 5 against 43 was suicide and retreated, history could have taken a different course. Leningrad could have fallen. The ring could have closed a month earlier, and then the victims would have been not 1 million, but much more. But they did not retreat. They dug their tracks into the earth and held the sky over the city exactly as long as was needed. Their reward is not a gold star on a jacket lapel. Their reward is millions of lives that continued. It is generations that grew up. It is the cobblestones of pavements that were not trampled by occupiers' boots. The monument to Kolobanov is not a bronze bust on a square. The monument to him is Leningrad itself, saved, alive, eternal. Justice triumphs not in offices. It triumphs in memory. Today we know this name. We know the numbers: 33, 156, 5, 1. We know the surnames: Usov, Nikiforov, Rodenkov, Kizelkov. We analyze this battle by seconds, admiring engineering precision and human resilience. Glory caught up with them. Late by half a century, but it caught up. War is dirt, pain, and injustice. But as long as we remember people like Zinoviy Kolobanov, war is not meaningless. Their resilience becomes part of our cultural code. It is the foundation on which we stand. And when it seems to you that an impossible task stands before you, that forces are unequal, that the whole world is against you, remember August 1941. Remember the lonely tank at the crossroads. Remember that the impossible is just a task that needs to be solved, coolly, professionally, to the last shell. As long as memory is alive, the armor is strong, and the crew of the combat vehicle is still at its post, somewhere there in eternity, guarding lines that cannot be surrendered.